My guest today is Dr. Harvey Risch, Professor Emeritus of Epidemiology at the Yale School of Medicine and VP of Epidemiology at the Wellness Company. We discussed the potential relationship between mRNA vaccines and the surge in all-cause excess mortality, as well as the emergence of turbocancers, the unknown origins of disease X, what it could be and what it means, and the possible connection between evolution and a higher power. Dr. Risch is a brilliant thinker at all levels and a man with a clear devotion to truth. This conversation blew my mind and covers a vast range of concepts that necessitate serious contemplation. Stay tuned. Dr. Harvey Risch, thank you for your time today, sir. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's great to be with you.
Yeah, so I told you before we started recording, but I've had you on a long list of people that I've really wanted to talk to, and this was one I really wanted to wait for to make sure I wasn't a complete buffoon for our conversation. But I wanted to start.
You didn't leave me as being the buffoon, but that's okay.
I think that's going to be very hard to achieve, but yeah, if you are, I'll let you know. Okay.
Okay.
I wanted to start by asking you a question that you've probably been asked 50 billion times and you're tired of answering it. But you are Professor Emeritus of Epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health. I'm guessing you know a thing or two about disease and transmissible diseases. So I wanted to ask you about the way that the CDC and the NIH responded to the pandemic. And in your view, whether their response was consistent with just basic epidemiological methods.
So there's a whole host of a range of epidemiological methods, both in public health and in scientific theory. And what happened, I think, during the pandemic is that both FDA, NIH, CDC, all of them lost control of what would have been their scientific narratives. And they did that because the pandemic management itself on day 7. So President Trump proclaimed an emergency pandemic on, what was it, March 13th of 2020. A week later, he handed it off to the National Security Council, which militarized it, which made the pandemic no longer a pandemic, but a biowarfare attack. And the eventual vaccines that we have called vaccines, even though some people have misgivings because of their genetic technology. Nevertheless, we call vaccines. They're not vaccines according to the government. They're countermeasures because it's a military approach that was adopted rather than a public health approach. And this military approach, which had people in the military underneath the National Security Council, design the response that all of our government agencies would carry out. They designed a response that did not follow public health principles. Those public health principles were laid out in an important paper about 2006 or 7 by Tom Inglesby, who's now head of the Johns Hopkins Center on Infectious Diseases, Tom Inglesby and Don Henderson, who was the principal scientist responsible for eradicating smallpox from the planet. These people knew a thing or two about public health management, and they laid out general respiratory virus principles, pandemic principles, such as you don't lock down the population, you quarantine symptomatic people. There's no point in closing airports, that won't do anything. Masks are essentially useless, that for either protecting the wearer or for controlling source control, meaning keeping the wearer from spreading the infection outside of the wearer, and various other things. Social distancing is kind of a fiction. It depends on the airflow circumstances, indoors versus outdoors, and what happens indoors. All of this stuff was all laid out, and then the military turned it around and did the opposite of almost everything. And so that colored our whole response. And what happened is that basically your rank and file people in the mid and upper middle levels of all these agencies are relatively good people who believe in themselves. They believe in the science the way they see it. They believe that they think they are doing a good job, the best that they could under the circumstances. They think of themselves as wholesome, good-doing people. and they don't realize that they are brainwashed, that they've been brainwashed by upper levels of our military establishment that are the professional brainwashers, because that's who the National Security Council pulled in to do the professional brainwashing of all of our scientific, medical, regulatory systems, as well as the general public. And we know how much brainwashing has gone on through the media and all of that. And so this whole regime of misthinking, of propagandized fear and lack of recognition of what were the true issues going on spread throughout the regulatory approval and scientific review institutions of our government. And so you have things like the FDA review committees, like the VRBAC, I think it is, committee that was set up as supposedly independent reviewers to review evidence for approval or emergency EUA approvals of the vaccines, thinking that they were doing good by approving vaccines, because of course vaccines are good, because all vaccines are good, therefore a COVID vaccine is good. Therefore, we want to see how we can do good, and as long as we have a rationale for doing good, then we can approve it. And so those rationales didn't actually comply with the nitty-gritty little technical details of how FDA has to make approvals, because it's minutiae of considerations or criteria, things like totality of evidence or preponderance of evidence, what the nature of the evidence was, and on and on and on. These are minutiae of regulatory details. And instead, these people were thinking in a much more simplistic fashion, this is an emergency. The vaccines are good because vaccines are supposed to be good. This one looks like it's going to work. We'll figure out how we can show it that it complies with the evidence for showing that it's a good vaccine. And that seems to me the thinking, the doing good thinking, rather than doing careful thinking, that characterized the good people who made bad decisions in approving these vaccines. Now, it turns out that their approvals were essentially irrelevant. It was just theater to legitimize that these vaccines weren't vaccines. They were countermeasures and were going to be used anyway, come hell or high water, because that's what the military at the top, the National Security Council, had decided in advance of this whole process unfolding. But it didn't want major riots in the streets, and so it had to put up this theater and the fear mongering and all the propaganda to make the population into a psychological sponge to accept these ideas that this is what is going to help them to get out of the pandemic, and that's how it unrolled. And it was planned this way. The military was involved in Event 201, the planning session meetings in September of 2019, and all the previous Event 201s, these were annual events beforehand. The military was involved in all of those. Why was the military involved? Because they knew that the likelihood of a bioweapons attack was grossly much larger, much higher than a spread from some animal reservoir into humans. And so they were heavily involved in the planning for this, and it shows as to how we carried out all of the pandemic management, because it was obviously twisted and contorted to be a military response rather than a public health response.
Wow. And so, in your view, did the threat of the SARS-CoV-2 virus ever justify the vaccine that they rolled out, or I guess experimental gene therapy that they rolled out to treat it?
So in my opinion, no. That at the time we were in the throes of the first year or so of the pandemic, we didn't know as much as we learned over the course of the various waves of the pandemic. And what we did learn is that we were grossly manipulated to think that the virus was so much more deadly than it turned out to be. We did that because of nefarious people like the British modeler who modeled 17 million or 30 million or whatever deaths were going to occur, if we didn't rein this in by doing all these things like locking down, some of which the Chinese did, and all that kind of stuff, that this was a propaganda of fear that made the population malleable to behave the way the fear mongers, the government agencies, and so on wanted us to behave. And that's kind of what led that the virus itself, we knew, for example, 3 weeks into the declared pandemic in early April of 2020, the state of Connecticut Public Health Department was putting out weekly reports on mortality numbers of deaths and numbers of cases by decade, approximately a decade of age. And it was very clear 3 weeks in that there was a 1,000-fold difference in mortality from the people over 80 to the people under 20 or under 10. And it's dramatic and it's very clear. And it was known 3 weeks into the pandemic. And by November of that year, not only did we know that, but we knew all these numbers to 3 digits of scientific accuracy. So we knew very quickly, before the vaccines were ever rolled out, that there was a large fraction of the population that did not need the vaccines, that under almost any conceivable risk-benefit analysis would have more risk than benefit to them. And of course, the way that this was managed by the government that sought to put the vaccines into everybody was that, oh, you're going to kill grandma. Now, this astonished me because I didn't see any reason, on average, that grandma couldn't get vaccinated if she chose to. And if the vaccines were supposedly doing what we were told they were doing, which is to prevent death, and so on, then, or infection even, as we were first told, then if grandma gets vaccinated, then it didn't matter whether grandson got vaccinated. Right? And so there was no real evidence. And once you start going into the nooks and crannies of this, oh, well, maybe grandma's got immunocompromised and can't get vaccinated because the vaccine would be harmful for her. Well, we don't, as a general societal rule, put young people, especially children, at excess risk to protect other small parts of the population. We don't do that. It's not a moral consideration in our society. Okay, we protect other parts of the population as best we can, and there certainly were ways of protecting them independent of vaccination. Nevertheless, one could have thought at the beginning, knowing all this about the risks, that there might have been a role for vaccination in a small segment of the population, people who would not otherwise be able to protect themselves, who had major chronic conditions or were elderly and feeble and frail and so on. There might have been a role for vaccinating them, although now there's debate on both sides of that issue also. But at that point, there might have been a role for vaccination, but not for everybody else. And nevertheless, that fact was hidden by fear-mongering and propaganda against the whole country. We were told that infection mortality risk was 3%, 5%, 10%. All these numbers were bandied about. They were abject lies. Okay, because we know the infection mortality risk is on the order, now we know, of about 0.25%. And that 0.25% is largely concentrated in high-risk people for whom one has to be more aware about proper infection management. And not the whole population as a whole doesn't have to pay the price of an unknown, inadequately tested, and potentially harmful vaccine to supposedly protect the population that really could have been protected on its own had that been the chosen path of the way the management of the pandemic went.
Yeah, and so, knowing all of this, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to formulate this properly. What do you think was the driver behind the vaccine effort then? I mean, was it purely profit or was there more to it?
Well, there are a few things. So first of all, profit is a gigantic motive, and that profit wasn't just for the pharma companies. There was lots of ancillary profit to be shared around. For example, NIH got some billions of dollars from its patents and agreements with Moderna. NIH had sent millions, tens of millions of dollars to Moderna to help in development of the vaccines. And so in return, they got a share in the profits. So here you have NIH getting money from sale of the vaccines and at the same time putting out public messaging that people should take the vaccines. An utter total conflict of interest getting money for doing something that it's regulating and telling you it needs to be done and should be done. And this is unconscionable and should totally unethical. And nevertheless, it's just one of the things, one of the big lies of the pandemic, of which there's been quite a number.
Yeah, and it seems like we've, throughout that process, we compromised most of our medical ethics and just ethics in general, right? I talked to Julie Panesi about it, and she had a really deep insight on what changed about humanity during that time. I mean, we fundamentally changed in a lot of ways. We got
Well,
rid of.
actually, I think nothing changed. I think what happened is that the cover was pulled off of an aspect of humanity that's always present. And I think there's an interesting essay in Tablet magazine that you can read online. I think it was by Ashley Fernandez, I think is the name. And this was why doctors joined the Nazi Party in Germany, why doctors rushed to join the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s. And it's part of doctors and other people who were able to put their empathy on hold in order to do an intellectual job, that they desensitize themselves to the ethical and moral side of things too easily. And therefore, they let themselves get sucked into these positions like the Nazi Party in Germany, which they thought of as being good because it was going to improve humanity, by eugenics. And they believed in the eugenics. They believed in getting rid of old people who don't contribute to the economic productivity of the society. And of course, Jews and gypsies and everybody else for whom they eventually put into the eugenics categories. And our doctors today are no different. They are absolutely no different in the fundamental psychological behavior of succumbing to plausible ideas that they can put their moral and ethical emotions and psyches on hold and just do their intellectual work. And that's how you could have doctors. This happened to my wife, her doctor, 3 years into the pandemic. She said, "Have you been vaccinated? If you haven't been vaccinated, you're going to die. You could die." That's what she said. This is, such utter nonsense. And yet you had doctors believing this. For what reason? Okay. Either that they felt risk to their careers, or they thought they were doing good. They thought, I'm a good person, vaccines are good, therefore I'll try to help people to overcome whatever reluctance they have. Without regard to data, without regard to science, without regard to knowledge, without regard to fear mongering, and so on. That's what doctors have done. And that's the common behavior. And it is what I will say philosophically is a problem of the intellectual mind.
Yeah.
That going through universities, the universities have trained, by and large, trained people not to use their common sense, but to think in theories. And theories are great. I love theories. I love biological theories. I love lab theories and the science that I've done and the medical research that I've done. I just don't believe any of those theories. I only believe things once I've validated them by studying humans, by studying the end result of how these theories bear out in evidence of the accounts and the properties of the humans at risk of these diseases. So until I know for sure with my common sense science that I've seen these things happen in real life, I don't believe the theories. And this is the problem that people, especially intellectuals, people who've gone through universities and further academic training, believe in theories. These theories are how they make decisions about life. And the theories go from absurd to insane. And yet they believe these theories. And they do that because these theories generally have some kind of little seeds of plausibility. So they can rationalize believing theories because they sound plausible, even though they're basically irrational and they don't deal with actual evidence and so on. But people believe them because they've been psychologically trained to accept theories as if they were evidence when they're not.
Yeah, and I think we saw that play out, in real life in front of us as academics and the intellectual class lined up to follow the mandates that made zero sense to any thinking person, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but and I think I'm kind of reiterating what you said here, but it's that they've been trained to think according to like a they've been trained to think down a particular channel, like in a particular way, and it's not really thinking, it's more just taking direction from people that they believe to be authorities on the matter, rather than using their own critical thinking skills to kind of pick apart a problem and solve it for themselves. Is that correct?
Well, I've said this, that college students come out of the college university experience spouting slogans that they're not reasoning. They're just recapping slogans that they were brainwashed with. You
Right.
know, sure, they know when to apply which slogan. They're good at that, but they have no idea about the validity of those slogans, the evidence for them, or lack of evidence, the contrary evidence, and all that, because they don't entertain that. And when one questions them about the slogans, they can't defend themselves, and so they censor or they leave, and because they don't have the evidence that they need in order to support that. And this goes to current thinking, which is this radical push to remove reasoning from logical behaviors, that people should think with their hearts, which is utter nonsense. You cannot have a society that lives on technical engineering for its standard of living to think with its heart. You know, I mean, if I would love for my dishwasher to fix itself, and until I call a repairman or buy the repair parts, it's just not going to do that.
Yeah, and so do you, as a result of this, have any concern for the future of anybody in the STEM field? I mean, do you see STEM changing, according to this line of thinking?
Well, I think there's always people who actually have their head on straight. So there are people who think critically, but I think that, the field is colored by what I've called lots of technical ability and no common sense. That, for example, when I first started in my first real job, which was as a professor at the University of Toronto, we were first putting in wiring through the building for what was proto-internet, the ability of different computers in the building to talk to each other, sending email from one floor to the other, as far as that went. And so we'd have the technicians who would come, and they figured out that the wires had to go into pins in the connectors to plug into the backs of the computers. And they would wire up the connectors really well, and each wire would go in its proper position in the connector, and they would just leave the connector there waiting for us to come back along and plug them in, not recognizing they had wired up the wrong gender connectors, that they had wired up female connectors to plug into female sockets.
Right.
Okay, this is lots of book learning. They know which wire to go where, and no common sense. They weren't paying attention.
Right.
And this is kind of my image of technocracy that we have. We have Jeffrey Tucker at the Brownstone just wrote an essay today on why appliances are failing. And they're failing because of regulatory overload, which is like regulatory inflation, which is every year appliances have to use less electricity and less water and still make bricks, make bricks without straw. They have to wash dishes with almost no water and with almost no electricity. Well, is it a surprise that the dishes don't come out clean?
Right.
Well, no, because the manufacturers have to comply with the government regulators, and only the marketplace comes back against the dishes not being clean, not the government regulators. Marketplaces are slow. Capitalism is slow at the marketplace level. And so it takes, 6 months, a year, 2 years before consumers figure it out that one brand of dishwashers that has that energy guide rating on its side is actually doing a bad job in washing dishes,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so by that time, the manufacturer's gone on to some new technology and some better thing that now breaks down at 3 days after the warranty, ends, rather than admitting that it couldn't cope with the regulatory restrictions. And that's kind of the way our whole society is being approached now, by people who make these bad regulatory decisions thinking that they're doing good. I mean, for example, and The prime example of this, I suppose, is flow restrictors in showers. And I'm probably going to get a lot of pushback on this, but but flow restrictors in showers make people take longer. And the reason for that, aside from the comforts of being in the shower longer, is that the intensity of spray is not all that related to how long it takes to get the soap, to rinse the soap off of you, or to rinse the shampoo off of you. It's a volume of water that actually does the carrying off of the soap and the soap residue. And so if the volume of water is cut in half, it will take proportionally longer, maybe not twice, but proportionally longer to do that. And so there's no net benefit or little net benefit in flow restricting of shower heads. And in fact, there's probably been some studies that show that people end up taking longer and use even more water because they're in the shower longer to get the benefits. And what they should have done, instead of regulating the water flow, was to regulate the solubility of the soaps and shampoos so they rinse cleanly faster, because that would have solved the duration of rinsing problem. But they attacked the wrong problem because they're not paying attention.
Right. I never thought in a million years I'd be having a conversation with Dr. Harvey Risch about household appliances, but this is awesome. It's the same, it's kind of the same idea as, low flow toilets, right? You flush 4 times when with a regular toilet, you would have just flushed once, right?
That's correct. The Europeans try to solve that problem by having a big flush and a little flush, depending on the type of waste.
Yeah,
So,
it is what it is, I guess. But
right,
I
right.
wanted to ask you, in the aftermath of these mRNA vaccines, we're dealing with a lot of different problems right now, or at least perceived problems. And one of them is, a sudden surge in all-cause excess mortality. And, Ed Dowd has done a lot of work on this. Of course, the insurance industry is very involved in this because they're the ones who actually have to pay out for life insurance when people die unexpectedly. Have you had a chance to look into any of this, and have you taken anything away from this in terms of the relevance of the mRNA vaccines to the surge in all-cause excess mortality?
Well, I think there's very strong evidence for this, that this excess mortality was largely in working age people, 18 to 64 years of age. It was seen in 5 or 6 insurance companies that reported this after Dowd had made his observations. And then I think it was Lincoln National Insurance in the Midwest and the US had made their observations that of this about working age individuals that had some 40% higher mortality rates. This was, I think, third quarter, fourth quarter 2021 and into first quarter of 2022. They were seeing this, or maybe I have the year wrong. It was a subsequent year, but anyway, this was being observed, and then 4 or 5 more European insurance companies chimed in that their payouts had increased. Some of them were reporting numbers of deaths, others were reporting dollar payouts. All of them were reporting increases. So this was very strongly suggestive evidence, because this didn't start during the pandemic and in the waves of the pandemic. It started in the waves of the rollout, of the vaccine rollouts. And then, interestingly, Steve Kirsch was working with Ed Dowd more recently and pointed out that you could look on these 2 websites for disability claims. In the US, the disability claims are on the FRED website, which I think is the St. Louis Federal Reserve compiles these numbers, and you can see what the weekly or daily or some number, I think it's weekly, numbers of disability claims are over time. And the UK has a similar website that's a little more difficult to get into, but produces the same numbers. And you can see that these disability claims look more or less constant, little bumps and wiggles, but stay around an average level of about 6,000, maybe 6,000 a week, if I recall, until somewhere into 2021. And then they start rising, and they just keep going up and up and up. So to whenever the claims went to, so the beginning of 2024, they had risen to over 8,000. This is a giant rise for no explanation, certainly not related to the virus itself, because it didn't happen then, and it rose dramatically after some time after the vaccines were rolled out, and the identical behavior and disability claims was seen in the UK data. So this again is very strong evidence that the vaccines were damaging people's health. Now, I would point out that good people can believe both sides of this situation, and the reason for that is that it's what I call my bridge analogy. So here you have an engineer designs and builds a bridge across a river, and the engineer finds that the bridge is 99.99% safe. And he says, wow, look how safe this is. How could you imagine something being 99.99% safe? And then he finds out that every day 100,000 cars drive over this bridge. And every day, the one car that doesn't make the 99.99% falls into the river. And so the people come to believe that this is the death bridge, that that this is a deadly bridge, that every day somebody dies on this bridge. And so, but then you say, well, if you had to go to the post office on the other side of the bridge, would you do it? And they say, of course. The risk is always like one in 100,000. Why should I be worried about this? Okay, yet it's a deadly bridge. Everybody thinks it's a deadly bridge. So the answer to this is that what you do in a population is totally different than risks people take on an individual basis. And so for individuals taking the vaccines, for most people, they did not observe serious adverse events from the vaccines. But on the other hand, when you give this vaccine to 300 million people in the US or whatever the number was, you're going to see tens or hundreds of thousands of people severely affected by something that was safe, apparently safe for the overall majority of everybody in the population. Each side has a valid claim to its opinion. The side that took it and got away with it says it's safe, and for most people, they claim it's safe. And yet, the tens or hundreds of thousands of people who were harmed or died from this say this is unsafe and we should never have used it at all.
Right.
And so you can see how each side has its own valid claims to understanding the data and the arguments going on in this.
Yeah, and so Dr. Dennis Rancor gave a presentation in Romania, I think back in November 2023 at a conference, and they did a study that estimates roughly around 17 million deaths globally from the mRNA vaccines. And I wanted to ask you if you had a chance to look at the study, and if you did, what you took away from it.
Well, I was present when he gave the report, so I saw all of his slides and his arguments, and I'll say that it's suggestive evidence. It correlates the vaccination rates with mortality across a whole pile of countries in the Southern Hemisphere, including Australia, Africa, South America, and so on. And so it's suggestive evidence. But again, it's the same problem. Even if it's true, 17 million people died out of 5 billion people who took the vaccines. Okay.
Right.
So we're still talking about small percents. That's the problem, that most people can still think that it didn't harm them, even though what you find now is that many people are not what I'll call immunologically normal. So you find that people who've had 3, 4, 5 doses of the vaccine have gotten COVID 3 or 4 times. They get other infections. I just heard of an acquaintance who's a physician and epidemiologist tell me yesterday, the day before, that every time she flies on an airplane, she gets sick. Every time in the last 2 years. Okay, and airplanes are not such hazardous environments, even when there are people that are sick, because of the laminar flow of the way the air is pumped through the fuselage, through the body of the plane. Nevertheless, she got sick. I've gotten sick myself once. In fact, those meetings in Romania, I got sick from. But I know that there was a person across the aisle who was coughing and sneezing and was sick. So
Right.
it was obvious where I got it from. But by and large, so she says she gets sick all the time from things that she never used to, and it's because her immune system was changed. And unless you have some dramatic effect that your immune system doesn't cope with, then it's really hard to pin down that you damage your immune system because of something you did a year, 2 years, 3 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you brought me to my next question because we've also seen a emergence of really aggressive cancers. And I've heard you talk about this before, and so I wanted to ask your opinion on this because turbo cancers have now become a thing apparently. And I when I first heard of turbo cancers, it sounded to me like flat earth. It was something that I was like, yeah, okay, this is going a little too far here. But then I looked into it, and yeah, we're seeing a lot of young people or just people in general developing these really aggressive cancers where they show up with symptoms and they're already at stage 4. I mean, there's really no chance to treat these cancers. In your view, can we attribute these cancers to the mRNA vaccines, or has there been a connection made there?
Well, I was skeptical when turbo cancer was first named, just like you mentioned, um, because you have to realize that in normal circumstances, solid cancers take 5, 10, 20 years or longer to go from when they start until they're diagnosed. Blood cancers, leukemias and lymphomas, are shorter. They maybe take 2 years, 3 years, and so on till they come to being symptomatic, or they're tested in a routine annual physical exam where it's seen. You can see on a blood sample that there's too many white cells in the sample. That's physically, you can see it. Anyway, so a year into vaccination, when this started being claimed, I was skeptical, thinking it's too soon to see this. People are just being afraid. But then more and more evidence started coming out. Now, the problem with the evidence still is mostly it's anecdotal. It's things like, um, well, I had prostate cancer, 5 years ago, and so I get an annual checkup with my oncologist. And this year, when I tried to make the appointment, I was told it was a 4-month wait. That's never happened before.
Yeah.
Okay, things like that. That doctors are seeing cases in young people of aggressive cancers that normally only appear and not as aggressively in older people. And this is unusual. However, it's too soon to know whether there's an excess in numbers of these cancers in the population, or cancers in general in the population, because the cancer statistics aren't um, that ready to be current yet. So, for example, the American Cancer Society puts out an annual brochure called Cancer Facts and Figures. And in it, they have their estimated numbers of cancers and cancer deaths that are occurring each year by state, by cancer site, and so on. And so there's a 2023 guide. That I think there may be a 2024 guide. And so you can see the numbers that they estimate. However, when you look into the details of how they do the estimation, they say that it's extrapolated from the most recent US, what's called SEER, SEER data that the US Cancer Registry System collects, which is more than 30 cancer registries in states across the US that collects statewide or large metropolitan area wide notifications of cancers, which in most jurisdictions is a reportable disease. So it collects these numbers and so gives it to the federal government. The federal government organizes it on the SEER website, and you can query that. It's a website, you can look at the numbers and so on. But the numbers, the last time I looked, which was I think the end of last year, only went through 2020. So it's still too soon to see anything related to the vaccines, only a little bit to um, to COVID itself. And I'm not seeing any signals when you look at 2020 by itself compared to previous years. So it's too soon, and the extrapolations from that are too soon. We're going to have to wait another year, probably 2 or 3 years, before we'll actually have real data on any changes in population cancer incidence by different cancer sites that we can try to use again to infer that there's something systematically happening from the vaccination. Just too soon, and that's where we are.
Yeah, and I mean in this case, just speculating, just pure speculation here, but could the immunosuppression caused by the mRNA vaccines be a trigger for, cancers coming out of remission or the appearance of cancers out of nowhere?
Yes, so that is true, that the immune system not only tries to reject foreign molecules of bacteria, viruses, parasites, and so on, it also rejects foreign molecules from the environment and foreign molecules in the body. So cancer cells go haywire and put aberrant molecules on the surfaces of their cells for whatever reason that they do that. And I don't know if a cancer could learn not to do that, it might grow better. But in any event, that's what they do, and the immune system tries to recognize those things. And when it's only a cell or two or three, the immune system can take them out as foreign. But when it's 100,000, some of those are going to escape. And the problem is if the immune system becomes inhibited about doing that because of damage either in what it can do or the aggressiveness of what it does in surveillance, then cancers that, and everybody has these cancers that occur and get taken out all the time, it's just the way cells work, that that these things are going to escape the immune surveillance and come out. Now, you made another point, which is good to observe, which is that not all cancers are new, that some cancers exist in an equilibrium between their growth pressure and the immune suppression pressure that keeps them from growing. But if you reduce the immune suppression pressure, they will come to diagnosis. And so for that reason, some cancers could come to diagnosis sooner, even ones that are not previously diagnosed. But they still kind of have to be there. And it's still going to take some time for that to happen. Whereas there are other cancers that are in remission, and the most well-known ones of this is female breast cancer, that these are cancers that are small, detected on mammography, say, or physical exam, but usually now more on mammography, that are excised, are removed, and may be treated with chemotherapy, that one doesn't see any obvious remains of the cancer cells. Nevertheless, there's a very good chance that they still exist, that they find sites in the body, biological sites, so to speak, where the immune system doesn't get very good access to them. And they hole up there and they sit there for 10, 15, 20 years until something triggers them to come out of remission, in which case they become full-blown cancers and women need to treat them. And this is the typical pattern of getting breast cancer in the 60s and then having to deal with the end of the remission period in the 70s or 80s. And so the vaccine effect on suppressing the immune surveillance may allow these cancers to come out of remission more quickly, which means that it's not generating a whole brand new breast cancer from scratch, but it's one that's already there, and therefore it's already gotten well along the pathway for coming to diagnosis, and so that's why the time could be so much shorter. So that is another possible mechanism.
Yeah, and so you mentioned earlier that SARS-CoV-2 was the response was taken up by the military and then treated as if it was a response to a biological warfare agent. And now we're being primed for disease X, which is strange how they're able to kind of predict these pandemics now, right? And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on disease X. To me, it's so opaque and vague. I like it's hard to even really process, right? Because it's like, well, what is this thing, and why are they announcing it almost ahead of time? Have you put any thought into what disease X could be, what it all means? I mean, do you have any thoughts on it?
Yes, disease X is the virus is coming. The virus is coming that Tony Fauci had been chicken little-ing for the last 10 years. Every year, a new virus is coming. It's about to here. We're going to have we're going to have a pandemic. We're going to have a pandemic until it finally happened. That this risk is always out there. And so disease X is just a virus is coming, a virus is coming. It's just Tony Fauci in another guise. It's fiction
Right.
until it actually happens. Okay. And the reason it would happen is because something leaked out of a lab that was inadequately controlled because the technology of controlling it was inadequate, because we even thought to be doing the research that would generate these agents in the first place, which I think it was a bad idea and should never have been done. Nevertheless, we have a biowarfare industry that is its bread and butter to do this research that's intrinsically hazardous and doesn't have the ability to control it from escaping from these labs.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just, do you? This is just an off-color question, but do you ever feel like we're in like a different dimension or an alternate reality here? Like somewhere along the way, we just kind of poured it over to some other universe.
Well, I agree there's a huge amount of surreality in all of this, and I've certainly felt that throughout the pandemic, between the lies and the propaganda that's been inflicted on us and the systematic nature of it coming from everywhere, and the response to it, which has been the workarounds of society to create alternative institutions, alternative media channels like yours and other podcasts and Substacks and Brownstone Institute and other places where people are not being censored to get out their understandings of the evidence of what's going on. And that's the way a free, checked, and balanced society is supposed to work. It's not supposed to be captured by interests in every aspect of the government and media. It's not supposed to be one where monopoly companies have so much money to use that they can control everything. The problem really is that, in the 1930s, we had anti-monopoly laws. We had laws that blocked being companies in restraint of trade. We enforced them, and we broke up companies. We broke up Ma Bell, AT&T, into all the baby bells and so on, because it was a monopoly. So we've always felt that capitalism worked to a point, but that crony capitalism and monopoly capitalism locked us into something that wasn't really capitalism. And so we had government laws to protect us from that. But now what we have is that the resources of large multinational companies have grown disproportionately to the population size that they interact with, that they economically relate to. And so, proportionally speaking, they have way more resources to control the marketplace than they used to have, even without being monopolies. So you could have duopolies between two companies that control a marketplace, and they don't have to have interlocking directorates to know that each one is doing more or less the same thing, and they're both getting outrageous amounts of money and providing poor health circumstances to the general population, and nothing can be done about it because they have so much money that they've corrupted all of government, all of media, and all of everything. And so that's the surreality of where we are, that our government has let this happen without pushing back. That capitalism is a workable system when it's a fair playing field, not when it's corrupted by what we call crony capitalism, which isn't really capitalism, it's fascism. And that's what happened, is our government let fascism happen because each person in their own campaign finance or their PACs took so much money that they became controlled by the institutions they were supposed to regulate.
That was exactly what I was just about to ask you, is if this was a fascist system that we're in. Because for myself, I'm a student of history. That's most of the reading that I've done in my life. This mirrors exactly every, I mean, it's strange because it's almost like they poured it in Marxism to kind of control us culturally, and then fascism over top. It was like the fascism piped in communism or Marxism to control everybody socially and culturally. But really, the overarching system that we're inside of is a fascist system. Now, I guess the next question I want to ask you is that, there's a new pandemic treaty on the table at the World Health Organization. Um, Amendments to the existing regulations. I think it's May when the member nations are either going to sign on or choose not to be part of it. We've seen, New Zealand has mentioned that they're not going to be a part of this treaty. Other nations are slowly pulling out. What's your view on this pandemic treaty, if you've had any time to look into it, and what do you think the consequences are for us in the West if we, decide to go in on it?
Well, I haven't read the details. I know about it a bit. There's both the pandemic treaty and the international health regulations. They're two separate things. The pandemic treaty was already signed some time ago, and what's being changed are the details. It's being amended. And apparently, you may know this history better than I do, but you can have a treaty that allows itself to be amended without having to be re-signed as a new treaty, without it having to be reviewed. I mean, who is minding the store about what amendments are being put into the treaty.
Yeah.
That being said, what WHO has said about this treaty and its goals is complete fraud. That the idea of the WHO establishing proper ways of managing pandemics at their discretion, their arbitrary discretion about what constitutes an emergency is another form of fascism. And it's basically volunteering your government to the WHO to be in charge of, to rule. And to me, it's totally absurd why any rational person would do this. Any uncorrupted person would do this. For example, WHO wants every country that does gain of function research, which is many countries, to make public to all the other countries the genetic sequences of all of the bio warfare agents that they develop and work on. And does this sound good? It's like, oh, well, then WHO will know how to manage if one of these breaks out. That's what you would believe. Okay, so what's the real reason? What could happen with this? I don't know if this is unintended consequence or intended consequence, but once every country has a recipe for the same gain of function agents, if somebody makes it and attacks somebody else with it, there's no way to tell who did the attacking.
Right.
There's no way to know who was the aggressor in that and who needs to be punished. And what that does is it allows anybody to do this, to tyrannize the world for profit, so that anybody can come along, do this, and then say, and now buy our vaccines that we just happen to have here on hand. Right? It's totally irrational. These are there, and there's a slew of these irrationalities that are in the treaty that nobody should sign off on. You don't cede control of your democratic country to a non-democratic institution on the basis of fear mongering.
Yes.
And fear mongering does not lead to rational policies. And yet, disease X is coming. We have to let the WHO take care of it. It's just pure fear mongering, and the governments and the WHO have learned how well fear mongering worked at the beginning of COVID. And so they're trying to take advantage of that and use it to their advantage to take control of everything.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. I mean, it's globalism, but like on steroids. It's turbo globalism. It's to another level. It's something that, I mean, the word democracy doesn't apply in any way, right? It's not democratic in any sense whatsoever.
Oh, well, it'll be a plantocracy and a rockocracy.
Yeah.
The rocks will have natural rights. It's
Right.
one health.
Right. That's exactly it. So, okay, I have one last final question before I completely burn you out. I I I have been working on this hypothesis of mine for probably 20 years, and this idea of evolution as a function of God, rather than something that runs in opposition to it. My thought has always been, as human beings, the idea is, as human beings, we're created in God's image. Now, you can translate that however you want, whether that's the physical image of God or consciousness in general, right? But we we create, right? And when we create things, we're always tinkering and updating and making them better, uh you know constantly. And so my thought has always been, if there is a higher power and a creator, then why wouldn't that creator constantly be reworking its creations? And that's how we see evolution take shape in our world, right? And that's how we see that process happen, is that it's real time innovation and real time upgrading and updating. And I heard you talk about this briefly, and I just wanted to ask you, as a scientist, as a, probably one of the top epidemiologists on earth, you have a comprehensive understanding of evolution. Have you ever thought about how it relates to, say, for example, a higher power or a greater being?
Well, I'm in awe of the natural laws of the universe. Now, one could argue that the natural laws aren't really laws, they're only mental human approximations to the way the universe works. And certainly, if you go back a couple hundred years, you would say that um, mechanics in physics explains really well how things work, how they fall and how they bounce and so on, and that we might have believed that those approximations were how the solar system works and the elliptical orbits, which in fact turns out they're not exactly elliptical, but it's close enough for timekeeping purposes, that you would have thought, well, those approximations are actually laws, until we got to things like quantum mechanics. And then you think, well, quantum mechanics is actually a law. Well, so quantum mechanics leads to predictions and measurements that are accurate to 1 part, I think, in 10 to the 11th, something like that, which is kind of astonishingly accurate and makes me think that it's probably a law. We certainly got laws in mathematics because those are logical, derivative, and all that stuff. But in physics, it seems to be the case as well. And that physics, of course, leads to chemistry, which leads to biology, that there's underlying natural laws in we have fundamental particles as far as we know them, that they behave in physics laws ways, and all of this stuff that makes one think that there is an amazing order to how the universe works. One of the more astonishing laws is that light particles don't go in straight lines. Light particles go in every possible path to get from point A to point B, all simultaneously, and nature integrates, does a calculus integral, so to speak, of the probability amplitudes of all of those paths happening, which is to create an average summary of all of that, all instantaneously, not at the speed of light, but instantaneously, to figure out what is the observed path. And this law of nature explains why light bends going through clear crystals and through water, why light bends in gravitational fields, around the sun, around stars, and things like that. It's astonishing that that this law explains something that is so unintuitive that we would never believe if we were exposed only to our common sense daily observations. And so I'm totally in awe of the fact that the universe does have this regularity, even though its flip side is chaotic systems, chaotic behaviors, which are not random, but that appear random to us because they're unpredictable. And this is the butterfly effect on the weather 4 or 5 days later, right? That you can have a deterministic system, so you have equations that describe exactly what happens, and you alter the initial condition by a microscopic amount, and it leads to a totally different outcome. That microscopic amount gets amplified all along the way till you get to the outcome, which is gigantic. And so that just because nature isn't necessarily predictable on individual events doesn't mean that it doesn't have systematic rules for how it's governed. It just means we don't have the technology, the intellectual or other technology to be able to understand or explain all of that. But in some cases we do on average ways, because we know that statistics and probability have theories on average behaviors of things, laws of large numbers and things like that, that explain how things happen on average, even if individual trajectories are unpredictable. So there's all this natural law background to how the universe functions. And I don't see why evolution would be anything different than any of that. That however the natural laws came to be, and what one might think of as brilliance, genius, or whatever it is, that saw that creating natural laws that work the way they do, could a universe have been created with natural laws that work slightly differently, with fundamental particles that have slightly different masses or different energies or different spins or different whatevers. Would that universe have worked just as well as this one? Was that ever tried before us? Before the Big Bang? These are theoretical questions we can't ever address, but the answer is that it's self-fulfilling, is because we got here because it worked. And so to say, was it designed this way? That's the only conclusion that I can come to, that I accept that the wisdom and intelligence that got this to work did it because it knew, when I say knew, whatever new means,
Yeah.
that this would work. And so that's what I'm in awe of. And to say that evolution is just randomness, it just sidesteps the issue in total, because evolution is a very powerful force that counters chaos. That in spite of it being generated by randomness, randomness is only half the process. Selection is the other half of the process. And the selection that encouraged focused evolution into things that solved the reproduction problem for evolution is what generated how we got here. And my moral problem with this is not that evolution took 5 billion years to get to us. I'm angry at God for that, but that's for a different reason. It's that evolution has the mutation problem baked in. And that means that mutations occur in biological materials, which includes young children. And those mutations can be bad and lead to terminal illnesses in people for whom I think there should be an ethical or moral reason why they're not deserving of those events.
Mhm.
And that to me seems like an immoral aspect of what we're supposed to believe is God with moral considerations. And so we don't understand how that could come about. And that's my main theological problem with all this. My problem with the 5 billion years of evolution is that 5 billion years is way too large to cope with the speed of light. The speed of light is way too slow compared to 5 billion years. What that means is it made the Big Bang push things that we could possibly communicate with too far away to be able to do that. And that means that anything that would try to communicate with us from the distance, the closest star to us is 4.3 light years. That means it takes light 4.3 years to get from that star to us, and another 4.3 years to get back. And so if we're trying to send them a message, we'll never find out for 8.5 years, whether they got it. And that's people around that star, let alone the rest of the solar system, let alone the rest of the universe. So what basically God did is he made the universe so big and the speed of light so slow that we'll never be able to communicate with any other intelligent life, and likewise they with us, under all known physics at the moment.
I'm probably going to listen to that like 50 times over the next few days and pick it all apart. The theological conflict that you have is one that I have. But what I've often considered, and maybe I'm just kind of pissing in the wind here, but what I've often considered is that maybe the macro is far greater than the micro, and that what we're part of on a consciousness level is so much bigger than what we're part of here on Earth in our individual capacity, that suffering that, say a child who has leukemia, that they endure, and then, they live such a short period of time and their life ends, but maybe they're part of something. We're all part of something far greater. And our experiences here, although they lend to that, they're insignificant compared to what we're part of outside of this.
Well, that might be, but still my moral reasoning depends on individuals' behaviors, individuals' responsibilities, individuals' efforts. And so it's hard for me to extrapolate to numbers when I'm still looking at it as bearing on individuals.
Agreed completely. And I think these are answers to questions we won't know until we're there, So yeah. Dr. Harvey Risch, thank you again so much for your time. It was such an enlightening conversation. Before we go, would you mind telling everybody where they can find you?
The best place to find me is on my Yale website. If you just Google or use some other search engine to go to Risch, Risch, and Yale, Y-A-L-E. You'll find my website. It's got contact information there. It has my Telegram and Twitter channels, and I post things on them from time to time, but don't converse on them. But in any event, there's readings there. I also have stuff on the Brownstone Institute. You can go there. I think listeners will find lots of the articles on Brownstone very interesting, even if they don't necessarily agree with them.
I love Brownstone. I talked to Jeffrey Tucker a couple weeks ago. Now I'm talking to you. I can't believe I get to talk to all these really cool people. So it's very awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Risch. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.